Good morning, and thank you to those who have joined us here both in person and virtually. We are in a new facility here. To those who haven't been here, it strikes you right away if you've lived in the other facility that it's modern and very nice and air-conditioned and a lot of things that we sometimes didn't have before. My name is James Cartwright, and I'm on the Atlantic Council Board. And I will host you today. I'd like to thank the Scowcroft Center for all of the support they have given both to this event and other events along the same lines, and for hosting the many events during the year that come here. You can, politically, things are changing. And so we're trying to adapt at the same time. And so you'll see some of our work today, both on the modernization side and on how we address some of the issues that we work on day in, day out, both here and abroad. In strategic context for today's space discussion, I'd like to go back just briefly and kind of bring us up to where we are today with some key points that have occurred in getting us here. In 1998, we had the Ballistic Missile Threat Commission, which was headed by Donald Rumsfeld. And in that commission, one of the things that came out of it was that the tie between space and the rest of our capabilities was growing ever stronger and ever more essential, and that we couldn't look at it as just another place and a domain that's out there, but we really don't do much there, and we're not going to tell you if we do. Along those lines. That was followed in 2001 by the National Security Space Management and Organization Study that was commissioned by the Congress, again, led by Donald Rumsfeld. And in that, the tie became much clearer as to missile defense and space and how they were interconnected, okay? In early 2000s, you'll recall that Rumsfeld became the Secretary of Defense. And one of the things that they did in the administration at that time was that they took operational control of space and gave it to Strategic Command, okay? To give it an operational voice for requirements and operations and planning. Along with space, they sent missile defense, ballistic missile defense to STRATCOM. And so those two missions were basically somewhat orphans at the time, and they were moved over under the auspices of United States Strategic Command. In the work up to that, there was a lot of work that was done by the JCS, the Joint Chiefs, on how this should happen, how to start to think about space, missile defense, the capabilities, and how to integrate them, and how to operationalize many of them. And the two models that were discussed were the model of the Army Air Corps and the Army, and how they separated into two services, and then the Navy Marine Corps model. The chiefs sided more with the Army Air Corps model, and the Secretary went more to the other direction, quite frankly. And so in the end, the model took several years and several kind of hard debates about how we should move forward. But when it came to STRATCOM, the guidance that was given to the commander of STRATCOM at the time was that I need an operational control, an operational and organizational path to a global defense framework, creating a voice for the joint warfighter operations as a joint functional component, okay? In other words, what's the path to go from where we are today all the way to potentially a service and a combatant command type organization? And how do you build that? And that was really the job that was given to STRATCOM. And so they stood up what was called Joint Functional Component Commands for these two activities, missile defense and space. Fast forward, so I'm not going to tell you every little thing that happened here. We got to 2019 and the stand-up of U.S. Space Force and U.S. Space Command as a sub-unified command. So from a functional component to a sub-unified command, which is the normal legal steps that you would take, and then eventually in 2020, then U.S. Space as a unified combatant command, okay? And so that's the path that got us to the organizational construct that we have today, okay? The Space Force and the framework document that we will discuss today is starting to align both vocabulary and planning constructs, componency constructs, all of the posture constructs with the general joint force in order to have a better and more coherent way of looking at space, okay? This is the first try, okay? And we'll talk about some of the warts, and we'll talk about some of the emphasis in our discussion today. And you should also be looking at those things and any questions that you might have as we finish the moderated part. When we stood up the operational command in 2020, today this framework really focuses in on the difference between supported and supporting, and that space has generally been looked at as a supporting command for all activities, but that there is now clearly a role that they want articulated in it being a supported command, okay? There is both a defensive, which is historically what we have looked at in space, and an offensive role that is emerging. And there's a clear articulation in this document about the offensive side. And that's going to be a cultural shift, okay, quite frankly. Joint force integration, another cultural shift. How do we get this into the planning constructs, all of the things that we've talked about? And in the bottom line is that the document attempts to accelerate the cultural shift in force generation, employment, and posture for space, okay? And how we're going to do that. So leading this off and hosting the dialogue will be Clementine Starling Daniels, and she'll moderate this as the director of the Forward Defense here at the Atlantic Council. Housekeeping notes, okay, that's my last required assignment here. First is that for the audience online, askac.org is how you submit your questions, okay? And second is that we are on the record, publicly on the record, for all of the comments and discussions that will occur today. And I look forward to those discussions. And Clementine, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Wow, what a fantastic set of scene-setting remarks from General Cartwright. So thank you, because I think that really helps provide context for the evolution and how we got to the Space Force as it exists today, but also Space Command. I just want to thank General Cartwright for his many contributions to the Atlantic Council's work on security and defense, and especially on space. So I am delighted to get into a discussion and frankly involve all of you, both our in-person and our virtual audience. So we're here to discuss the US approach to competition and security in space, generally, and specifically the approach of the US Space Force. Our conversation will center around this document, and I think we have copies outside for those who are here, which is the Space Force's recently released Space Warfighting Framework. As General Cartwright teed up for us, this document is a very rich exploration of how the US Space Force plans to engage in military operations in space, in peacetime, crisis, and in conflict. And it really illustrates growth and development in the Space Force's doctrine since its establishment under the first Trump administration. So we have an expert panel here to help us understand what's in this framework, why is it important, what are we thinking about it? So let me just briefly introduce our panelists. First, we have Dr. Jennifer Cannon, Government Relations Director at the Aerospace Corporation. Then we have Dr. Peter Hayes, professional lecturer of space policy and international affairs at George Washington University's Space Policy Institute. And then we have Victoria Sampson, Chief Director of Space Security and Stability at the Secure World Foundation. Fantastic. So let's dive on in. Victoria, you and the Secure World Foundation release annually probably what is one of the best open source annual assessments of threats in and to the space domain. So can you say a few words to help our audience understand the nature of the threat environment that the US and its allies are currently facing in space? And what trends in counter-space capabilities are you watching for that might make the space environment more competitive or dangerous in the future?
Sure, thank you, Clementine. So when Secure World Foundation first started our global counter-space threat assessment 8 years ago, we covered 6 countries, and our document was about 150 pages long. The most recent one, which was released in April of this year, covers 12 countries, and it's over 320 pages long, and we already have a 13th country we're going to be adding next year. So I think one trend is clearly there's a proliferation of counter-space research and development around the world. It's not just U.S. Adversaries, it's also U.S. allies and partners. So we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing a lot of countries developing military space organizations. Russia and China did theirs in 2015 and 2016. The U.S. obviously did ours in 2019. Japan did theirs in 2019. France did one in 2019. The UK, Australia since then. So we're seeing a lot of that sort of thing. We're seeing a more complicated space environment as more countries depend more heavily on space capabilities for national security missions, for economic functions, for how their society works. There's more of an incentive for their adversaries to invest in counter-space capabilities. And when we talk about counter-space capabilities, a lot of different definitions. We look at 5 different kinds. We look at co-orbital, the idea that something is launched, it gets up into orbit, and then does something to threaten a space asset, whether it's destructive or non-destructive. You have direct descent, which uses kinetic force to impact a target in space. We have directed energy, so lasers, microwave warfare, stuff like that. Electronic warfare, jamming, spoofing, and then cyberspace. And we also include space situational awareness. Not that doing it means you want to have a counter-space capability, but if you're going to do counter-space, you want to have SSA capabilities. A big picture, too long didn't read version, is that no country has used destructive counter-space capabilities in a conflict. What we're seeing is a lot of non-destructive counter-space capabilities, so electronic warfare, spoofing, jamming, cyber, that sort of thing. Pretty much everyone uses that. And that's considered, a low bar to entry. It's relatively cheap. It's relatively easy. You have plausible deniability in terms of who did it. And it's not escalatory. We're seeing research and development in terms of the more escalatory destructive counter-space capabilities, direct descent, co-orbital, things like that. But only 4 countries have done these sort of destructive direct descent anti-satellite tests. US, Russia, India, and China. No one else has done that sort of thing. We're also seeing an increase in terms of rendezvous and proximity operations, both in low Earth orbit and in geostationary orbit, and that's being done by the US, Russia, and China. So there's, again, it's challenging because there's no red line, which is a good thing maybe, because that doesn't mean you're on to make escalatory, but it's hard to know what will be the thing that causes us to go over the edge. And so that's why it's important to have discussions like these to talk about, theory, policies, concerns, to communicate so that we don't have inadvertent escalation.
Thank you. That's really helpful kind of scene setting for why we're talking about space warfighting as a framework in the context of how the environment is shifting. Peter, let's dig into that. So US space doctrine has evolved over time, and this framework really marks a significant milestone for the Space Force in defining its doctrine for today's era. Tell us how space doctrine has evolved from the Cold War era to where we are now today.
Well, first, I'd like to thank you and the Atlantic Council for the opportunity to be here, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I think my presence is really a reflection of a mistake that the Department of Defense has made, because the true experts that should be reading between the lines of this important document are guardians, because they're the ones that developed it. So it was a mistake not to allow them to come forward. I have been studying space doctrine for a long time. I think I have some important things to say about that. In my judgment, the document in front of us, that's the subject that we're talking about, is really important because it marks a clear break in the most open and unclassified way that the department and the Space Force have ever articulated about exactly what it is that the Space Force intends to do. In my judgment, this document compresses what it took the Air Force about 30 plus years to determine, and that is that air superiority is job one. Without that, you can't enable all of the other things that air power provides. And really, the Air Force went round and round on that, even in the face of things like the Berlin airlift, which was a decisive application of air power, but they were still focused on strategic bombing. So eventually, over the course of these decades, they come to the realization that, hey, in order to do any of those things, you need air superiority. So again, my hat's off to the Space Force for recognizing that early on as the most important enabler of everything that space can provide. And again, in my opinion, the Space Force guardians need to be the ones that are out here articulating that, because many aspects of this are going to be controversial, both in the United States and around the world. And they will hone their ideas and improve them most effectively, I would suggest, in the most hostile audiences towards that, because they will have to defend these ideas. And of course, they won't be popular with everyone, but that, in my judgment, is the world we live in, and they need to be effective warfighters in that. Everyone would love it if space was a peaceful domain, but that ship has sailed. So thank you.
Thank you, and we will dig into what we mean by space superiority in a moment. But Jen, your research is focused on the establishment of warfighting culture within the Space Force. And obviously this is a distinct kind of publication on that. So help us understand why the Space Force has been so focused on the development of, a separate identity, and the role that frameworks like this document can play in that.
Sure, thanks Clementine, and thanks for having me here. I just want to give you all a little bit of my background to help you understand where I'm coming from when I tell you what I'm going to tell you after this. But for my career, I was an F-15E weapons systems officer, so my job was to employ weapons at the tip of the spear, mostly in the Middle East when we were fighting in Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom. So based on that experience, I will say that it is really hard to understand what war is going to be like if you haven't actually been in it. It's really hard to understand the urgency of the decisions you're going to have to make when people's lives are at risk. And so when we talk about guardians needing to change their culture, having this huge culture shift within the Space Force, I really think, and I keep pressing, that these guardians need to understand the reality of the war that they are supporting and enabling and operating in, right? And so instead of decisions like they normally make now being made on the timeline of days or weeks or months, these decisions are going to have to be made in seconds, minutes, right? Not days. So right now, you're comfy in your operations center, but that's not what war's like. And so part of my recommendation for these guardians, and perhaps in a next iteration of the space warfighting framework, is to truly define what that urgency means and how important it is for our warfighters to experience that before they have to do it for real in a crisis.
That's a salient point. Okay, let's dig into the document in more detail, because there's a lot in there in only, a relatively light document. But not light in terms of the issues it's addressing. So the warfighting framework, as Peter outlined, really defines kind of space superiority as the goal of the Space Force. And General Cartwright kind of talked about this shift in the Space Force has traditionally been seen as a supporting supporting force, to the rest of the joint force. And that's obviously still a really, really important part of their job, right? This kind of notion of you need space superiority, to be able to protect things like on a surface level. So instead of air superiority to enable stuff on the ground, it's like a level up where space superiority enables air superiority, and it enables what we're doing on the ground. So kind of colleague and I coined this as like a surface operations instead. Well, not coined it, I'm sure others have. So let's kind of talk about that. So in the framework, space superiority is defined as the ability of the US and its allies to operate at a time and place of their choosing without prohibitive interference from space or counter-space threats, while also denying the same to an adversary. Peter, tell us more about what it requires to gain and maintain space superiority, and then walk us through how the framework outlines space control as enabling space superiority.
Well, sure. First, I'd like to mention that the definition of space superiority in this space warfighting framework is very similar to the way that the Joint Staff has defined that for a number of years now. So it's basically enabling your own freedom of action in a specific domain while denying that to your adversary. And as you mentioned, Clem, the framework then says that space control is the way that you achieve space superiority, and then it further defines space control into counter-space operations of the offensive and defensive variety. At these points, this framework somewhat departs from other doctrinal statements, like in the Joint Publication 314 on space operations. I don't think that that's a showstopper. Again, I'm most concerned that the Space Force Guardians are the ones that most closely develop their doctrine. But to the extent that it aligns with and supports joint doctrine, those are all important considerations as well. So I believe that over time, these concepts will be refined and further developed. A final thing I'll just mention with respect to that is, I mentioned previously that this is the first time that there's been such a public articulation of offensive space control capabilities. So I consider this the opening of the door towards that, but in my judgment, much more needs to be done in that regard. I would really like to see the fact of certain capabilities be unclassified, and I'm certainly not suggesting that we go full open kimono on any of these things. But if the United States can share that it's developing a B-21, I certainly believe that it can do similar things when it comes to space things. We're not going to give you the radar cross-section of the B-21, but we're going to tell you that we're developing that. So that has great implications in terms of deterrence and helping the Guardians themselves understand what kind of capabilities are available to them. Because for too long, they just really haven't necessarily had access to that, because most of those offensive space control capabilities were held in special access program channels. So that makes it extremely difficult for people that aren't read into those programs to understand what those capabilities are. And ultimately, we would like Guardians to have a more comprehensive understanding of all those things, and for our international and commercial partners to at least have some knowledge about them as well, if we're to have a more holistic and comprehensive strategy for doing these things.
So I could jump on that?
Yeah, please do, because I want us to get into the, and maybe I'll just kind of first on one point, because you raised, the document outlines counter-space operations as being kind of, that's the central way to enable space control. It then clearly defines examples of offensive and defensive activities within counter-space operations. And it says some of there is kind of bleeding between the two, but it's very stark that this is kind of one of the first public documents really outlining more of an emphasis on the offensive side. So I'd really like to bring you in, Victoria and Jen, to kind of get your thoughts on that. Kind of does that mean, what are the implications of that? Are we seeing a transition to more of an emphasis on offense, and what does that mean?
Right. So just an example of the problem we run into with this type of lack of the overclassification is that, for example, the U.S. has the X-37B space plane that we don't really talk about. We don't really talk about the mission. We just have it up there for 2 years at a time. When stuff is released from it, we don't really put it in the public catalog for a while. And the U.S. is allowed to do that, but what happens is that we set the tone, we set the standard, we set the norm for how these sort of things are done. So, for example, China has their space plane, the Shenlong. Guess what? They don't talk about the mission, they don't talk about anything, they just put stuff up there and come back down. And again, it's a problem because if you want to have a way of communicating about capabilities and out of inadvertent escalation, you need to understand what's up there and what's going on. In regards to how the warfighting framework talks about threats, they have basically 3 types of counterspace capabilities. They have orbital, electronic warfare, and they have cyber. And orbital strikes from space to the ground, and then electronic from there. One of the issues that I have had with this, and I think I've brought on to discuss the contrarian view, but I understand the ship has sailed. This is going to happen, but I will die on this hill. I think it's a mistake to call space a warfighting domain. I truly do. I think it makes sense to call it an operational domain. That's what NATO does. That allows the U.S. military to function in it. But calling it a warfighting domain, as Pete said, there's complications. Internationally, the United States is viewed as being a bad actor in space. The United States is viewed by our rivals as being the one that's weaponizing space, as the one who is making space an unsafe, unpredictable domain. Whereas we know China and Russia are doing the same things we are. However, they are smart enough to call space a military domain. And why does that even matter? So what? They don't like us, so what? Internationally, the United States is having discussions in multilateral fora about norms of behavior and what we think is responsible space actors do. The United States needs other countries to sign on to the way we view things because this affects us. This affects us the most. We have the most to lose for an unpredictable, unstable space environment. And if we can't get other countries to sign on to the way we think about these things, we are going to lose. And the United States loses the moral high ground internationally, where Russia and China can point to us saying space is a warfighting domain, therefore, other countries don't have to listen to what we say. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for us internationally, even more so as this doctrine is being written down and publicized and made in unclassified form.
So, Peter, Jen, this kind of conversation around is space an operational domain, as NATO defines it? Is it a war-fighting domain? Is it a military domain? One, there absolutely is an argument to be made that word choice does matter. At the same time, the framework is trying to add meat to the bones, so to speak, of kind of what space superiority, what space control looks like. So do you have different views on this? This kind of concept of space warfighting and the emphasis of that by the Space Force?
I'll start. I don't think it matters, Clementine, if we call it a warfighting domain or an operational domain in the United States. But what I think does matter is our ability to work with our international allies and partners on this subject. And so if we could reach some common consensus on perhaps more details underneath that domain, it doesn't matter what you call it, right? How do we work together on space control? How do we grow the capabilities both endemically and work with our allies and partners to get their capabilities that might be better than ours, right? And so that's what NATO can be used for, an operational or warfighting domain. We have right now the Five Eyes, right? So the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand. All of those countries are down representing their space community at the Schriever War Games right now in Alabama. And I think that's a big step to ensure that everybody is able to work together and bring their best capabilities to the fight, but also work on the classification problem, the minimizing classification on what we don't need to highly classified. I will bring up the international partnership strategy that Air Marshal Godfrey has been highlighting the last few months, and he's been working with the Chief of Space Operations to ensure that we can have a strategy that brings in those allies and partners. And one of the items that is in that strategy is how do we minimize classification so that we can all work together?
I'm really glad you brought that up because I did want to talk about the international implications of this framework. This is, I mean, Peter said it, like, in terms of the kind of rapid evolution in Space Force thinking, they deserve a lot of credit, I think, for putting stuff out there. But there was the commercial space strategy last year that the Space Force released off of the DoD commercial integration strategy. Just this July, there was the international partnership strategy that Jen was just mentioning. And Air Marshal Godfrey, you know, he's a senior allied officer occupying a role of Assistant Chief of Space Operations for Future Concepts and Partnerships. And I think it was General Saltzman who said that position was created to hold the Space Force accountable, quote unquote, to integrate allies and partners into Space Force, force design, force development, force generation. So how should allies and partners react to this space warfighting framework? How should they see themselves within this and also the other key strategies that have come out from the Space Force in recent months and the last year?
Well, I can take first answer to that. I absolutely agree. I think there's definitely a role for international partners in terms of U.S. national security considerations and, you know, make sure that space is a predictable, stable domain. The problem we run into, it's not necessarily the Space Force warfighting doctrine, but to be honest, let's be blunt, over the past 6 months, this administration has done a lot to blow up our international partnerships with traditional allies and partners. I was in Europe in June and talking to people there. They don't see the U.S. as a predictable partner anymore. They are looking at, say, we don't know if you're going to pull out of NATO. We don't know if you're going to levy, you know, 75% tariffs on us. We don't know if you're going to follow your spending predictions. You know, the United States isn't paying for its UN dues. So the issue you run into is that the Europeans in particular, they're investing very heavily in their military space capabilities because they don't know if they can work with the United States anymore. And on one hand, yeah, I think it's good that they're investing more. I think it makes a stronger tide lifts all ships. On the other hand, that the U.S. will lose out if we can't depend upon our international partners and allies and these sort of things. I think we need to do much to strengthen that. And, you know, it's not just the Space Force's responsibility. I think this is a great start in terms of the international partnership. But there has to be a whole of government approach to show that this is a priority for this administration. And I'm just not seeing that.
I really agree with a lot of those points. And going back to the previous question about what the best term is to describe space, I really have to violently agree with both those positions. I mean, there are costs internationally for describing it that way, but in the final analysis, it's really about how well you can work with your commercial and international partners, regardless of how you might semantically define it. Again, I'm of the opinion that we would like a more peaceful domain, and maybe in the fullness of time that will evolve, but that's not where we are right now. So we can't be naive about what the reality is. And again, I applaud the Space Force for moving out on this. Going to the commercial and international dimensions, I was directly involved at the Pentagon in helping to develop those last year. And one of the things that really struck me, Clem, was that as far as we could tell from the lawyers, this was the first time DoD had articulated publicly a commercial integration strategy for any domain. So again, kind of my hat's off to the Space Force. A final point I'll just mention is we're really lucky in the United States how dominant our commercial space sector is. Since 2019, Elon Musk has launched more satellites than the rest of the world combined. That's a dominant position, folks. So we would be moronic not to leverage that. I mean, I know he's a somewhat mercurial actor, but you know, that's a great blessing that the United States has gleaned over the years, and we need to leverage that as effectively as possible and do it in the most transparent and enduring ways possible.
Fantastic. So we got a lot to get into. We've got some great questions coming in from the audience. Just a reminder, use askac.org if you want to submit them. I'm going to weave some audience questions in because I have many of my own questions, but I want to bring in others. So we have one here from Maeve Cuddy. that says the document advises against overly restricted rules of engagement in order to prioritize national security. Why does the Space Force need more flexible rules of engagement to advance US national interests? What, if any, are the downsides to flexible ROEs? I'm going to take that.
I can address that. So, along the lines of no previous main discussion about offensive space control capabilities, this is also getting into what are the specific rules of engagement. So that's also novel to be talked about. Traditionally, those permissions to engage in these kind of things were held at the White House. So the document doesn't explicitly talk about that, but one of the goals of the Space Force and the Department of Defense in general is to move that to a lower level of approval. And as the document highlights, it draws a distinction between command and control and battle management. So it is basically saying that if you have clear rules of engagement, then you don't need a mother may I for some things that are going to happen very rapidly. And that kind of goes back to the point that Jen made at the beginning, that as space becomes increasingly an operational domain, it will necessitate that guardians with more permissive rules of engagement are able to take action at a lower level. And I think that will be helpful.
And they need to practice that. They need to get used to doing that, right? So when I was flying fighters, we would practice every day how to make those really quick decisions. And so these exercises that they continue to do will help them with that urgency.
Yeah.
And then one thing, though, I have a question about. I don't know that this has been an issue. Has it been restrictive? Have there been circumstances where they have not been able to do the things they need to do to protect U.S. national security interests because of this? Or is it just because the Space Force wants the free hand? I mean, of course, they're going to argue to have no restrictions. I would too. I would want to have, if I'm running my own rules, I'm like, yeah, no gods, no masters. But is it really necessary? Or is it lending ourselves to a way in which the Space Force can, again, maybe make decisions, as Jen keeps saying, in the heat of the moment, that could be escalatory. And again, against the United States national interests.
Bring up a few key themes here that I want to dig into. But one key thing, it's figure 1 in the framework, discusses space denial. So I want to get into that. So when an actor may not be able to control the domain by operating how it wishes, but it may have the power to deny the use of the domain to others through counter-space capabilities. So in figure 1, it argues that denial of space to both the United States and an adversary, i.e. mutual denial, does not result in a stalemate, but rather favors the adversary. So do you agree with that? And can you explain to the audience, why might that be? And how should that potential condition shape Space Force strategy?
Well, I was really pleased to see that framework or that chart, that 2x2 chart in there. And I agree with it. I think it's a reflection of the fact that the United States is the most dependent on space of any actor. And we generally are engaged in what the DoD calls away games, not close by our continental territory. So space is absolutely essential in order to conduct those operations. And if space is denied to everybody, it results in a net loss to the United States in terms of conducting those kinds of operations. So I was really glad it framed it up that clearly, because I think that reinforces the main message of this framework, that the United States must have space superiority in order to support the joint force and to conduct normal military operations that are heavily dependent on those space capabilities.
One thing I'll say in defense of the joint force is that they always have a backup plan. So if space isn't working, you have your backup, right? Not optimal, but we do train to it every day.
I want to bring up missile defense, and Golden Dome is not actually kind of featured in the framework, although it's probably a factor in the timing of when it was written and released. But multi-layered missile defense, which is kind of the intention of Golden Dome, has implications for space, right? While it's still very much kind of under development, a layered missile defense shield will likely include space-based sensors, missile interceptors, using orbital vantage points for early detection and rapid response. So what are your thoughts on how this will fit into this framework?
Oh, I mean, we already have a multi-layered missile defense system. That's not new. We already have, the ground-based mid-course defense system. We have the Aegis. We have the THAAD. We have Patriot. We've got sensors. So that part is not new. I think integrating them all will be new. And since General Getline is the Golden Dome czar, and he's Space Force, obviously the Space Force will have a role to play in this. The part that's not new, that is new, is the space-based interceptor layer. It's unclear right now what that's going to entail, whether it's going to be kinetic, interceptors or directed energy. Hard to say, but I think that's going to change a lot of things in terms of strategic discussions, because there's a reason why the United States and the Soviet Union had the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and then during the Cold War, there's an incentive to throw more offense at defense, and so by developing a sort of space-based interceptor layer in order to get missiles during their ballistic or boost phase, that just incentivizes our rivals to build more missiles. The more you throw up, eventually you're going to get through. And that's a challenge, because that means that we have to build more interceptors, and that becomes a real challenge in terms of space traffic coordination, that sort of thing. And that's not even assuming that it's going to work, or we can do it in a timely manner for a reasonable amount of money. And then again, strategically, there are issues because Russia and China for many years, they've been pushing internationally a treaty for prevent the placement of weapons in outer space. This is, basically that. So does this mean that now they will be building up their own systems? I don't know. And the last thing I'll say is that, a space-based interceptor, I could have a whole discussion about the challenges and technical cost for that. It's not really an effective missile defense capability, but it's a great anti-satellite capability. And so is the U.S. opening that door by saying, we're going to put anti-satellite weapons in space? Does that mean that other countries will be doing that as well?
Peter, Jen, you have thoughts?
I have something, yeah. So let's talk about what happened last week at the Missile Defense Agency. They announced a $151 billion contract mechanism called SHIELD that will allow American companies and also allies and partners to bid for, to be a part of this multi-layered missile defense capability. I think the goal of that is to grow the American and the allied industrial base, but also allows us to play better with commercial and industry. So hopefully with this multi-layered missile defense it's in the works right now, I think requests for proposals are due in the fall sometime, that we will be able to grow those endemic and allied capabilities.
And if I might, I would just emphasize a couple other aspects. The executive order that President Trump signed back in January explicitly called for the Department of Defense to develop and deploy space-based interceptors capable of boost phase intercept. So I don't know of another policy statement that is so clear and direct about that. Do it. You want boost phase intercepts because that's where you get the most leverage. I would disagree with Victoria about the effectiveness of these things, and I would go back to the architecture that the United States did not deploy at the end of the Cold War, but it was predicated on brilliant pebbles. So brilliant pebbles were independent single interceptors. The architecture that the Joint Chiefs approved in the late 1980s was about 4,100 brilliant pebbles designed to take out half, 50% of the Soviet Union's SS-18 force, and then 30% of follow-on strikes. So I think some aspects of that are very important. It's not this leak-proof defense. As was mentioned, these are parts of layered defense systems. But again, the way you get the greatest leverage is by boost phase intercepts. So I think it's a very important part of any architecture. I completely agree with Victoria with respect to the implications of such systems on the counter space mission. If you have 4,000 or more of these interceptors, that's a tremendous kinetic space control capability, folks. And you can't hide that. You can't design that out of a system that is effective for boost phase intercepts.
Yeah. I'm going to turn to some really great audience questions that we have coming in now. We have two that focus on kind of the allied piece. One here from Neil Wolf and the other from John. So I'm sorry, I will pull it up. So John asked, before I pull up the next one, US allies and partners have developed increasingly independent military space branches over the past few years. To what extent are US space warfighting concepts aligned with those of key allies? And then just for the sake of time, I'm also going to ask you a two-for question, which is about Operation Olympic Defender has expanded, and when General Whiting described it in a keynote address to the NATO Space Center of Excellence conference in May, it was met with significant approval. How does the framework impact the continued growth and success of Olympic Defender? So if you can kind of tag team those two questions.
I'll say for the first question, I think it's the other way around. I know firsthand that at the Aerospace Corporation, we're actually helping other people develop their frameworks and their policies, right? So the United States was the first one to really jump into this game of having a space force, and they all want to know how we did it. So it's not really the other way around as far as I'm aware.
Well, I would just also mention, I think what gets lost in this a lot of times is that both the Russians and the Chinese created a space force in 2015. So everyone focuses on the United States doing that in 2019, but we're not the leaders in this activity. And I would agree with Jen with respect to the US being engaged with many of our allies and partners over a very long period of time to help them understand what space brings to the warfight and think about their own doctrine and organizational structure.
Right, take Operation Olympic Defender. I mean, that's the idea that the U.S. and its allies will work together and figure out, okay, if we were to do some sort of conflict in space, how would we actually do it from a military coordination perspective? So, I mean, that's, again, if you want to have joint warfighting, that is the way you go about doing it, by coordinating with them. So it's developing. I think they're working on it this year for War Games, but they're also working on it independent of that. It's getting stronger. But again, none of our allies or partners have described space as a warfighting domain. And again, limited capabilities in terms of offensive counter space. I think most of our, the French have been probably the most open about talking about a space-based element, and that's when they have a co-orbital counter space capability that they've been talking about developing with either kinetic or actually lasers as well. But that's about it. The rest of them, it's more the idea of electronic warfare, cyber, contributing space situation awareness, that sort of capabilities.
And for those not really familiar with Operation Olympic Defender, I'd like to just say it's an enduring military operation, just like any other operation we've had, Operation Enduring Freedom, Iraqi Freedom, right? So it is a military operation, and we do work with our allies, like Victoria was saying. We still have a lot of classification issues that we need to work through, and so that is related to the international partnership strategy as well.
Yeah, and that has been a running theme in our discussions, the need to kind of lower classification levels within reason. So we've got a question here, because we've talked about the commercial space sector a little bit, but a question from George. Working with the commercial sector comes with risks. SpaceX nearly removed Starlink services to Ukraine at the start of the war. What are the Guardians doing to strengthen communication with private enterprises and ensure that they do not pose a risk to national security?
I wish there was a Guardian here to answer that question. But maybe he can.
Well, we talked about U.S. reliance on the space domain and U.S. reliance on commercial services. Right?
Well, I think one of the most specific things to address that is Star Shield instead of Starlink. So, I mean, the SpaceX folks have contracted with both the Space Force and National Reconnaissance Office to build aspects of their overall architecture which are more directly supporting the commercial sector. I'm going to also just come at this slightly differently because one of the things I don't believe gets enough attention is you have a private actor, Elon Musk, determining what is traditionally a state decision about the use of force. I mean, since 1648, as I learned in political science, Westphalian system, states have a monopoly on the use of force. Well, he's determining as a private citizen when and when not that's going to be used. It's very interesting to me that he shut it off in September of 22 because he thought a strike on naval vessels in Crimea would be too escalatory. And I note the Operation Spiderweb, which was an incredible strike against 4 widely scattered airfields across Russia, attacking nuclear-capable aircraft. That only could have been enabled by space-based communication systems for the command and control. It was 117 drones. They live streamed it out. They said they had direct control of each one of those drones. So kind of different in terms of how those two things operated. And again, it's not the right way to run the railroad to have a private citizen making those kinds of decisions.
I agree. I think when SpaceX nearly removed Starlink services, at that point, no one was paying for it except for SpaceX, right? They were donating it. And that was, I think, the impetus for the US government to actually start covering some of those costs. And so what I've been told, and I've asked US military officials about this, like you have a very mercurial, as Pete described, a person in charge of something that's entirely crucial for how the United States gets to space, whether it's commercial, military, people getting to the space station. How do you deal with it? And they said, well, we depend very heavily on contracts. The lawyers are going to save us all, apparently. But that's something that they really depend upon for getting a reliable, predictable capabilities. And so far, SpaceX has followed all of its contract requirements, as far as I know.
And we work really well with SpaceX. I mean, we use them for our launch capabilities. You just saw Crew 10 on the Dragon capsule come back safely. So they do a lot for NASA and for national security space. And so they always do fulfill those contracts.
Okay, we are surely running out of time, but maybe we have time for 2 more questions. And there are so many great ones here, so apologies that we're not going to get to everybody's. But we have a question here from Colonel Steve Schinkel, retired US Air Force. How do you see the space warfighting doctrine contributing to deterrence theory in space? Are we better off for openly discussing space warfare and competition topics, or are we just arms racing?
This is a theory question, right? And what I always like to bring up is the security dilemma. And Victoria was mentioning that earlier. It is a theory, right? So we don't know if that's the way it's going to happen, but that's how people theorize if you continue one-upping each other, that eventually it's going to be like that Dr. Seuss book where, the 2 warriors have this little pea-sized weapon of mass destruction. Who's going to go first? I read that to my kids often. That's not what we want, right? And so when you talk about deterrence, Colonel Schinkel, in that way, you have to ensure that you don't give everything away, right? Because that's not deterrence if you tell them everything. But I think openly discussing these capabilities that the United States has does allow for a little bit more deterrence, saying, hey, I can do this if you act on me, or because of all these attacks that we've seen in the last several years every day on our space assets, we can actually do something about that, and now they know.
The thing that truly concerns me is that, independent of this warfighting doctrine, the United States has a different concept of escalation than Russia and China do. And I think that's where the issue is. The United States escalation as one way, it's a ladder. You go up, you increase escalation, increase stress. Russia, and particularly China, they look at it as kind of a dial. You can turn up escalation, you can turn down escalation. And so if we don't understand what the other is thinking, we will be sending messages they will not be receiving, and we will be misunderstanding the messages they're sending us. And that can lead to possible conflict.
I might just add that I had the opportunity to do a paper on modernizing space-based nuclear command control communications last summer. And one of the things that really stood out to me is just how far we've come away from the original conception of what those systems were designed to promote in terms of a more stable and non-use environment. You have today nuclear saber rattling in ways that we've never before seen. We have emergence of China as a emerging nuclear peer. So we have not developed the kind of stabilizing theories that we had when it was a bipolar world with mutually assured destruction. And there's certainly nothing like that in space. So if there's any opportunity for you theorists out there, it is developing those kinds of things, because we need some prospect that we can avoid these kind of harmful arms race dynamics. Again, I applaud the Space Force for developing this. They are the war fighters that need to do that, but that doesn't mean we want to go do that. They need to understand what their job would be. It's just like Strategic Command had to figure out how to fight the most ruthless nuclear war possible. That didn't mean we went and did that. It's for deterrence. So I feel in a similar way about space. I wish we didn't have to do this, but I think we do.
So one final question to leave us on, and I invite you to kind of share any concluding thoughts or things that you feel like we haven't touched on. But it's a question from Ian Smith. One of the Space Force truths in this document is that Space Force capabilities are critical to the joint force and the American way of life. How does space superiority translate to military success in other domains? And what would a day without space look like for the American people?
Ian, I would encourage you to Google A Day Without Space, US Spacecom, and watch that video. It provides a much better description than we could in a minute that we have left. But for those who don't think about this, space touches everything we do every day now.
One of the things we didn't talk about is our friends in Russia are apparently planning to have a nuclear weapon stationed in space. And if a nuke goes off in low Earth orbit, it pumps up the Van Allen radiation belts, and it basically causes all commercial satellites to fail. All. Okay? That's about a $500 billion event. And then the overall economic impact of that is probably $2 to $3 trillion. That's bad.
Cosign. But I would also point out as well that space is so crucial and important, and so we don't want to speak into creating this sort of threatening environment that we don't against our benefit and our best wishes.
Okay, well, thank you to our audience for some really tremendous questions. Thank you so much to our panelists for digging into this with us. I think the takeaway is, if you're not already convinced, we rely on space for absolutely everything, everyday life, and also to support national security missions. So credit to the Space Force for adding thought onto kind of what space superiority looks like and why it's important. And I hope we can continue to engage in dialogue on this, because there's clearly a lot to discuss. How do you bring that into reality? But thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you all for joining us.